Good day to you all. Today we are going to embark on a study of the origins of yet another of the world's great religions, this time the expansive realm of Islam, which brings us back geographically to the Middle East or Near East, where we've already looked at the birth of two world religions that are still around today, like this one is, Judaism and Christianity. We'll also see that the three monotheistic religions, the three we've just mentioned, have a lot in common, but there's a lot of differences as well. Looking at the pre-Islamic world in this part of the globe, focusing a little bit more on what's now Saudi Arabia and the city of Mecca, before Muhammad was around, before Islam becomes a religion, helps us to put it into perspective and understand why it makes sense that a guy living in a trading city on the coast of the Red Sea would be the founder of one of the world's religions. So pre-Islam Mecca, this trade center, how does this make sense in terms of a world religion starting here? This was a very cosmopolitan trading center and city, and so an ideal place for collective learning, a phrase we used way back at the opening unit on prehistory in this class. Basically, information exchange. And our textbook tells us that the religion that came out of Muhammad's thinking and his thoughts put to paper, the Quran, Hadith, that there is a certain mix of religious ideas that seems to that he was aware of, Christian ideas and Jewish ideas and other maybe tribal religions from the region, and in a sense ended up mixing these together. But in a trading city, right, that's something we shouldn't be surprised at, but now we should actually expect it. For instance, when we looked at the Silk Roads in a previous lecture, we know that along with trade and commerce and sort of market exchange, often comes exchange of ideas, especially religious ideas. So this then gives us, I think, a better perspective on why it would be here, of all places, that yet another monotheistic world religion that goes on to have a gigantic influence up into the present on the world. Why here? Why Muhammad? The Quran, as Karen Armstrong, written many books on Islam, says, did not put forward any philosophical arguments for monotheism. Its approach was practical, and as such, it appealed to the pragmatic Arabs. The old religion, the Quran claimed, the one kind of tribal gods before, was simply not working. So Muhammad was around at a time when things were changing a great deal on the Arabian Peninsula and in the sort of wider Middle Eastern, Near Eastern world. So in some ways he was sort of in the right place at the right time to see something like this happen and be the centerpiece of it. So Muhammad, the prophet in the Islamic world, the Muslim faith does not see Muhammad as a god, as Christianity sees, and Christians see Jesus Christ. They do see him as a prophet, however, a divine inspired prophet, God sending messages to him. So that part of it is similar to some of the religions we've looked at before. But not too much is known of his early life, much like Jesus, we've talked about already. And also, like Jesus, what we do know, or think we know, seems to indicate that he really didn't start preaching a message which became a new religion until his 30s or 40s. And as Arthur Goldschmidt, in an old but very workable book on the history of the Middle East, says, one night in 610, during the Arabic month of Ramadan, Muhammad was visited by an angel who exhorted him to read aloud. In awe and terror, he cried out, "I cannot read." Embracing him, the angel ordered, "Read, in the name of the Lord, read, for the Lord most generous. He has taught by the pen, taught man what he knew not." Everywhere he looked, he saw the same angel looking back at him. Fearing that he had gone mad, Muhammad hurried home and asked Khadijah, his wife, to cover him with a warm coat. Being God's messenger to the Arabs was an awesome task for an unlettered, middle-aged merchant and orphan who had gained a precious hold on a little wealth and status. Muhammad was tempted to shirk the responsibility, and yet, when he received no messages for a while, he feared God had abandoned him. During this time, he kept asking himself whether he really was a prophet. A few of his friends and relatives believed him, and gradually he convinced himself that his mission was indeed real. So Muhammad, again, doesn't seem to be, at least first, or from our vantage point, cut out to be a religious prophet. He came from a merchant family, a relatively prosperous one, but was raised by more distant family members because of family tragedy. So an orphan, from a merchant family, not what you'd think would be the type of person that would found a great religion. This story, by the way, about the knight in 610 and his early kind of wanderings, moving to caves to be alone to think this stuff through, not necessarily peacefully. It apparently caused him a great deal of angst and anxiety to figure out, was this really God, or had he gone indeed crazy? But this is a famous story. Islam and its relation to Judaism and Christianity, I've already alluded to it. All three began in the same part of the world. Okay, fair enough. Abraham as a prophet. So all three, believe it or not, some of you may have known this already, recognize Adam, Noah, and Abraham, all from the Old Testament, as prophets of God. Both Christianity and Islam recognize Jesus as an important prophet, although Christianity also sees Jesus as the Son of God. So this is true as well, which is, I think, very well known in our country today, and that is that Muslims saw Jesus as a legitimate prophet. They just didn't see him as also a godlike figure or a god. It's also true that they did think that the message of Muhammad did eventually supersede the message of Jesus. So they saw Jesus as a prophet of value in his own time, but the new prophecy coming from Muhammad had now made Jesus unimportant or far less important. Jews and Christians claim a connection to Abraham through his son Isaac from his wife Sarah. Islam claims connection to Abraham through his son Ishmael from his servant Hagar. So I won't go on with the rest of them, but there are significant connections here. Another way to say all this is that the Muslim God is seen by Muslims virtually as the same God that sort of Christians and Jews worship. I'm not saying that they believe the same things about God to this day. All three of them are quite different religions in many ways. These are just the similarities. So Muhammad, we know, then was from a place where there were a lot of different peoples exchanging ideas as well as goods. And so should it then, be that shocking to us that his religion, the one that he founds, has some elements consistent with these previous monotheistic religions from the same region, that he incorporated some of the same prophets and stories into his own. Not a surprise. The most important religious text in Islam to this day, though not the only one, mentioned the Hadith before, there's some other more minor ones, is supposed it is the Word of God. From that point of view, remember, I don't take sides on religion at all. So if somebody says, on our screen from the past that this is the Word of God, do I believe that today? Not necessarily, but I hold that to be true to all religions that we've covered: Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, and now Islam. So I'll just sort of put forward what's being said with that qualification. So the Quran is God's word. It's also a lot, and the Hadith as well, a writing down of Muhammad's thoughts and ideas, oftentimes by other people who became followers of his. Karen Armstrong again said the Quran did not put forward any philosophical arguments for monotheism. Its approach was practical, and as such, it appealed to the pragmatic Arabs, as I said before. The old religion, the Quran, was simply not working. That I think is worth repeating, as I did, so that we understand that this really was in many ways a down-to-earth religion, at least in its early years. It also, Islam that is, claims to be a synthesizing religion. The synthesize means to bring things, various strands, threads together. Stephen Prothero in God is Not One, who I believe I've quoted in every unit that includes one of the religions, world's religions. He says that while Judaism is about law and Christianity is about spirituality, they say the Quran combines the two. The Quran's earlier and often shorter surahs focus on spiritual matters, while the later surahs and often longer ones, Medinian surahs, get back to the importance of Medina, focus on social, political, and economic matters such as marriage, war, and gambling. The Quran tells Muslims not just how to worship Allah, but also how to lend money, divide estates, enter into contracts, and punish criminals. One of the Quran's most persistent social themes concerns justice and poverty. The Quran articulates a preferential option for the weak, speaking out forcefully and frequently on behalf of the blind, the lame, and the sick. The pious, the Quran says, give food for the love of Him, meaning Allah, to the needy, the orphan, the captive. So concern for the poor, the downtrodden, the oppressed is a major concern of the religion, and it's central to many passages in the Quran. Back to Stephen Prothero again, the Quran glories, however, not in this world, but the next. So though it's a pragmatic, practical religion, as Karen Armstrong points out above, it's still true that for the most part, you're setting up this world for the next world, which the early Christians were doing as well, and for a long time, many Christians thereafter did the same thing. That this life was to be used to get you into heaven and prepare for the afterlife. He goes on, more than any other great religion, Islam emphasizes life after death. Hundreds of verses detail the horrors of hell, the splendors of paradise, the rewards awaiting martyrs, the mechanics of resurrection, and the prophecies of procedures of the day of judgment. Exactly what this all means and how literally or metaphorically it is to be taken is up for grabs. But hell and paradise are described in the Quran in far greater detail than hell and heaven in the Christian Bible. So they both, of course, emphasize those same elements, those same features of religious life in the world as they see it, but the Quran does so more than the Bible. The famous 5 pillars of Islam go back to the beginning, and here's where you can see, I think, some very practical basics in the religion. The 5 pillars include: 1, that there's only one God, right? Muhammad, Allah, and Muhammad is His messenger. The second pillar is that you're supposed to pray you're supposed to pray 5 times a day. It eventually means praying while facing Mecca. Giving alms, giving charity to the poor is the third of the pillars. Making at least one pilgrimage to Mecca is the fourth. And finally, fasting sunrise to sundown during the month of Ramadan, holy month there. Many of you who are not Muslims might know at least some of those. There are very few non-Muslims that know about all 5. Quoting Professor Armstrong again, the new sect would eventually be called Islam or surrender. A Muslim was a man or woman who had made this submission of their entire being to Allah, God and his demand that every human being behave to one another with justice, equity, and compassion. It was an attitude expressed in the prostrations of the ritual power, salat, which Muslims were required to make 3 times a day, later 5 times. Muslims were also required to give a regular proportion of their income to the poor in alms. So she's just sort of repeating what I did, but she's saying it a little more eloquently than I did. They would also fast during Ramadan to remind themselves of the privations of the poor who could not eat or drink whenever they chose. Social justice was therefore the crucial virtue of Islam. Muslims were commanded as their first duty to build a community, the Ummah, characterized by practical compassion in which there was a fair distribution of wealth. This was far more important than any doctrinal teaching about God. Far more crucial was the effort, jihad, to live in the way that God had intended for human beings. Far more crucial than. Muhammad was raised in Mecca in a trading family, appears to have become a merchant trader himself, and appears to have tried to convert citizens of Mecca to be followers of him and his new set of ideas, religion, but only got a handful, and wasn't even able to persuade his a whole family to follow, even though he was a few. So he began preaching about 613 AD in Mecca, but within about 10 years or so, he decided, and his followers, as well, to flee inland on the Arabian Peninsula to a place called Medina. And while in Medina, not only did he start picking up more converts, more people showing up who were inspired by the message, by this rapidly spawning religion, but Muhammad ruled as a political leader as well, even a military leader, leading troops to raid caravans of goods from other groups as a way to survive. It was a common way to survive and thrive was to raid caravans of camels packed with goods. So he was not just a religious leader, spiritual leader, but also political, military, even economic leader as well, while in Mecca and beyond. And this becomes important in the history of subsequent Islam and the Islamic world, right up until today. Eventually, when he felt he had enough followers and enough things were sort of in place, he went back to Mecca with his followers and was able to force the city or talk the city, a little bit of both, into succumbing to his leadership and to sort of move over to Islam. That doesn't mean everyone in the city, but most of them. He mainly had to leave Mecca because he was unpopular for trying to spread this new religion at the time, when many in Mecca at the time, before he came back, thought that their old tribal religions were the right ones and didn't approve of this guy coming around trying to sort of shake all that up. But Muhammad, as religious leader, political leader, military, economic leader, made Islam quite different than Christianity in certain ways. In Islam, again, up until the very present, nothing, not politics, not the economy, not culture, is separate from religion. Now, Christians, will say the same thing about Christianity, that their whole life is permeated by Christian values and their Christian beliefs, and that's, I think, fair enough and true. And some Christians practice that more than others, and some I know some that do. But I think it's very safe to say that by and large, in Islam, it's taken much more seriously. One of the issues that Muslim extremists have with not just the United States, but the West, the European countries today, is that they see the West as having a decadent culture. And they see that as a result partly of there being too little overlap between political authorities and the religion and itself. They don't separate the two nearly as much as we do in Western countries. So and what I'm saying is this goes all the way back to Muhammad being, from the time they moved to Medina, his followers and him, and then back again and beyond. From that point forward, when Muhammad became both spiritual leader and political leader, the two have not been separable really at all in Islamic thought, Islamic culture, the Islamic way of life. I like to get back to this author, Stephen Prothero, who we've quoted before. If you remember, perhaps you don't, that with every religion that he deals with in his book, and he deals with all the world's major religions, he shows that all of them, he boils it down to this. All have a problem that they're trying to solve, all have a solution, and they all have a technique that they use. And the one on the chapter in Islam is not entirely straightforward, but I've basically pieced it together as follows. The problem is false belief in self-sufficiency, meaning humans all too easily start to fall into fooling themselves that they're self-sufficient, that they don't need God, they can do everything themselves. And it's a kind of forgetfulness in some ways. They forget that they need God. Prothero saying, the Quran seeks to shake us out of this forgetfulness, to remind us of our radical dependence on God, and to offer us ways to practice humility to God primarily. So the problem, as they see it, is self-sufficiency, human nature too easily being tempted to get full of itself and for various other reasons move away from God. So a recognition that you're not self-sufficient, that you're always dependent on God, is the problem. Or getting rid of self-sufficiency and going back to dependence on God is sort of the issue. The solution, right, is complete submission to God. In the Quran, there's a question put to the faithful. So have you surrendered? Meaning, have you surrendered everything to God? The technique used to make this happen, to go from problem to solution, is consistent and serious adherence to proper practices, or what's known as orthopraxy, at least the fancy word for it. Orthodoxy, you probably have heard the word orthodox before, if not orthoprax. But orthodoxy means proper belief. Orthopraxy means proper practice. So our text makes it clear, Prothero in this book makes it clear, that Muslims, of course, had strong religious beliefs. But we've seen this before. Different societies and different religions, different cultures place a different emphasis on the belief side and on the practice side. And Muslims put at least a bit more emphasis on the practice of the religion. Praying 5 times a day is a big commitment in practice. On a day-to-day basis. So orthopraxy over, but not by much, orthodoxy. Another passage from the Quran says, say not you have believed, but rather say we have submitted. So even there, in that pithy quote, it's saying it's not about sort of the doctrine or dogma, written in the Quran or Hadith that that you believe or have believed. It's that have you submitted? Have you submitted to God's authority? So I like this slide just because and I like this formulation by the author here, because it really does kind of zero in a pretty clear and concise way on what the sort of main tenets of this or that religion are. The early followers of Muhammad, when he died, the leadership of what became an empire by conquest, as we'll see, a vast, sprawling empire by conquest, we'll see momentarily. But for a time, one of his successors was his cousin and son-in-law, Ali, but Ali was assassinated in 661, and this caused a great deal of unrest. It shook the Muslim world in ways that still reverberate today. The conflicts that came because of this still exist within Islam to this day. Early on, the leadership after Muhammad of the Muslim world was supposed to be the leader was supposed to be selected or elected by other leaders, but after Ali was assassinated, and sort of one particular subgroup of Islam took power unto itself and created what became known as the Umayyad dynasty. They made it a hereditary monarchy, more or less. So the Umayyad dynasty handed power down from generation to generation. But this caused a deep fissure in the Muslim world, as I said. But Ali is still seen in parts of the Muslim world as a martyr and a sort of true hero for the faith. The caliphs, as they were known, basically they were the leaders. And again, this is something we won't see so much in Europe. We didn't see it in Greece or Rome. But the caliph is both a political leader and a religious leader at the same time. So the caliphs were Muslims and serious ones, but they're also at this point leading troops in battle as the Muslims start to conquer a big chunk of their region and nearby regions in the world. So following Muhammad's own precedent, Abu Bakr, the next in line, or the next selected, I should say, succeeded as religious, political, military, across the board leader. Caliph basically means, or Caliph means deputy. So, but that means he's the number one guy because the other sort of leaders and the main group of leaders selected him to be Muhammad's successor. But they went on, Muslims with a large military force and an inspired military force. Some of their success in conquest, I think, has to be attributed to the religious zeal with which they took their message, their religion to other lands. Yes, they did it by sword, but they also did it by the book at the same time. And this was an attractive religion to a lot of people in a lot of places. Many of those they conquered willingly converted to Islam. Not all, but many. And they tended not to press the faith all that much, but they didn't necessarily have to because it was popular. And this series of lightning and widespread conquests united the Muslim world ever after by faith and by language. Arabic became the language of the Muslim world. Not that there aren't other languages in that part of the world as well, but that became kind of a universal language. Much like in Europe, Latin will go on to become a universal language for hundreds of years, even though there are vernaculars underneath that. The forces of the military forces of the Muslim conquests took Syria and Palestine. The years you see there, most of Mesopotamia from the Sassanid Empire, conquered Byzantine Egypt and North Africa. A decade or so later, they toppled the Sassanid emperor and incorporated Persia into their Muslim empire. They took the Hindu kingdom of Sindh in northwest India, so that's getting pretty far away, and moved into northwest Africa in the other direction, and Spain. So they're basically spread out by 1720 or so, right? Only about 100 years after the beginnings of the conquests, less than that, from Spain all the way to western India. So that's a bigger empire than the empire of Alexander the Great. The creation of the Umayyad dynasty came basically in 661, and its capital was at Damascus, now in Syria, in a very much war-torn region. The difficulties of governing this vast multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious empire were considerable. And the Romans had already dealt with these kind of problems before, but now it's the Muslims that are dealing with it. So it is true that, and this is pointed out a lot, that the peoples that were conquered, say as far away as Spain, they tended to be allowed to have a lot of autonomy and carry on their daily lives, their old culture and customs, pretty much unmolested by Muslim authorities, which we also saw was true of the Romans, more or less, also. And they let Christians and Jews practice their own religions. There was some respect in Islam for those two other monotheistic religions. Sometimes they refer to Jews and Christians as people of the book. But nonetheless, they were treated as second-class citizens if they were living in areas conquered by Muslim forces. They had to pay an extra special tax that Muslims didn't have to pay. So they were tolerated. They weren't, arrested, exiled, executed, forced out of their own religion, but they weren't considered equal at the same time. So the caliphs, getting into a bit more understanding of sort of what they conquered, when, where. You can look at the map and see that green shaded area is, as I said, a far-flung kingdom indeed. So what explains this rapid expansion of the Arabs after the rise of Islam, going back to the time of Muhammad? There was prolonged drought on the Arabian Peninsula, so some of this may have been economic and political desperation, desire to channel energies of the new converts. So these people were zealous and gung-ho, many of them anyway, and this helps to explain the size of the green part of the map you see here. Economic policy to extend trade and bringing surplus producing areas under control. Also, I think fits as a partial explanation. Strength and leadership of the armies that had come from Bedouin Arabs, herding peoples from the Arabian deserts. Both Byzantine and Persian empires, nearby competitors, were weakened by fighting each other. So this helps the Muslims. I'm not saying they wouldn't have carved out an empire had Byzantium and Persia not been at war with each other, but this certainly was a timely advantage for them. And last but not least, and I've already said this, there was extra motivation because of religious beliefs and religious zeal. So all these things together and others that we haven't mentioned explain, at least partially explain, the rapid rise, this gigantic expansion. This doesn't get talked about that much in our country. We talk about a lot of empires in history, the Roman, the Mongol, the Chinese, but this one doesn't come up very much, and I think it is surprising to people if you're first learning about it, how big geographically and in terms of population size this empire was. In a world history text, the author says, once the armies had prevailed, Arab administration of the conquered areas was relatively tolerant. Sometimes government was left to local officials. Conversion to Islam was voluntary in accordance with the maxim in the Quran that, quote, there shall be no compulsion in religion. So the Quran does state that you're not supposed to forcibly convert other people. That's a little misleading because just like we see in other religions, Christianity, any other, people don't always, even serious religionists don't always live up to the texts that they think that they do or say that they do. They may interpret it differently than you do or someone else did, so they may be truly of the belief that they're doing what's sort of the righteous work of God, but that's not always the case. Even Muhammad, in some ways, wasn't always tolerant of people outside of the faith. But it is in the Quran, and so this is an ideal. An ideal means it's a goal. It's something that is valued, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's 100% true in reality. It's the direction that those that make the rules, the philosophy, itself is trying to go. So religious dissent from within, the Sunni Shiite split, and this gets back to the assassination of Ali. And you probably do know, I don't know how much you know about the history of the Middle East in more recent years, but the two main branches of Islam are the Sunnis, which is the biggest, and the Shiites. And they've been split ever since the assassination of Ali. The Shia sect began as a party supporting the appointment of Ali and his descendants as caliphs. So, but by them supporting his descendants as caliphs, what that's saying is that they're supporting a guy as the legitimate caliph that's not the acting caliph. Why? Because the acting caliph is a Sunni, and it becomes hereditary. So when Ali, is assassinated, and then things go strictly into the hands of this hereditary monarchy, so to speak, and they don't turn back. And so it's the followers of the caliphs that basically took power by assassinating Ali that now represent the majority of Muslim support, Sunnis, against the smaller group, the Shiites, who still follow the descendants of Ali, even though they never actually ruled and made the decisions. So the Shiites became a kind of a party ever after fervently devoted to restoring Ali's descendants to the caliphate, the spot of caliph. Have some different doctrines and holidays than other Muslims, so there's some differences, to be sure, in the way that they practice and think of the religion, Sunnis and Shiites, that is. The more traditionalist group, even though they were sort of usurpers at the beginning, are the Sunnis. The majority of Muslims who accepted the caliphate moved away from Ali's descendants. But this is a hot issue to this day. Sometimes when it does make the press, it is, I think, sometimes overblown. That's a big surprise, isn't it? So there are times in history and places even now where Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims live together, and they live together peacefully and get along with each other. But not everywhere, and it is a serious conflict in many places where it does exist. But the media does make it sound like Sunnis and Shiites everywhere can never coexist, and they're always fighting and going to war with each other. That being said, a lot of the, not only, but a lot of the conflict in the Middle East now is still due to this split and the two groups fighting against each other up until the present. God is not one. Prothero remarks, there are many interpretations of Islam. There is no Muslim pope to issue infallible encyclicals, so Islam is a big tent theologically. The most basic division in the Muslim world pits Sunnis, who constitute roughly 85% of the world's Muslims, against Shias, who account for the remaining 15%. There are some tiny groups that are there as well, but it is mainly 85 to 15. The Shia minority has split into various branches, most notably Twelver Shiism is known. So even within Shiism, there's a number of branches and splinter groups there. Twelver Shiism predominates in Iran and southern Iraq. Ismaili Shiism, another version, has a strong presence in India and East Africa. According to Twelver Shiism, a 12th Imam, again, follower of, descendant of Ali, will eventually return someday as a Messiah-like figure. So the Shia belief here in a 12th Imam who's going to come back is somewhat like the second coming of Jesus, in a sense. So Ali, his son Hussein in the Shiite tradition, Hussein was killed in the famous Battle of Karbala in 680. So another famous moment and controversial moment within Islam in this ongoing tug of war between the Sunni majority and the Shia minority. Prothero saying every religion is a chain of memory, and a key link in this chain for the Shia is the martyrdom of Muhammad's grandson Hussein at Karbala in Iraq in 680. This time-turning event is remembered each year during the Muslim month of Ramadan of Muharram. And so not only is there a special place for shrine for Ali in sort of Shia thinking in the Shia heart, but for his son Hussein, they're the same. So both father and son are seen as heroes and martyrs and are worshipped even to this day in the Shiite part of the Muslim world. The Abbasid dynasty follows the Umayyad, and there was a rebellion in Persia by a leader named Abu al-Abbas. He defeated the Umayyad army in 750 and installed himself and followers eventually in a long-lived dynasty. You see the years above there on the right. Abbasid rule showed administration of the empire that they overthrew. They did that fairly effectively, considering they just come in and took control of it without previous experience running it. But they were more interested in just administering what they already had than conquering new territory, which was a smart move because that empire, as we've already seen, was vast. They moved the capital from Damascus in what's now Syria to Baghdad in what's now Iraq, the round city with the green domed palace. They sent governors to the provinces, one of the two ways you can govern if you've got a vast empire. The ulama are people with religious knowledge, special religious scholars, and the qadis, judges, set the moral standards of the Muslim community and faithful, and settle disputes at the local level in a court system. There was a standing army, which means a full year 24/7 army, professional army instituted here, which is a move in the direction of greater complexity. Separate departments of the bureaucracy, also the same, an example of a complex society becoming more and more complex. Sounds like a no-brainer to us, but splitting different departments and making them specialize in taxes, foreign policy, postal service, finances, etc., is a step in a much more complex direction for any kingdom at the time. They maintained the Persian roads that they acquired through conquests, so they didn't really build roads themselves, but they didn't need to, because the Persians had made good ones, like the Romans had in their own time as well. The high tide of the dynasty came under the reign of Harun al-Rashid, and this included a golden age. Golden age of early Islamic civilization. Baghdad became a fabulous metropolis, center of banking, commerce, production, learning, writing, art. So there literally was a golden age, which included a cultural, intellectual, artistic renaissance as well. Baghdad was as large as several 100,000 people. Estimates vary, but it was a big city, very big for the time. Abbasid power eventually declined and fell, partially through weakening internally as a result of civil wars, but also by outside invasion, namely by the Seljuk Turks, came from the Turkish peninsula in the 11th through the 13th centuries. The Seljuk Turks were also Muslims, but from a different group, and they eventually took down the ruling dynasty. So the Golden Age sees a golden age that's a hub of cultural exchange, very much so. Professor Perry, I've quoted before, says Muslim science, philosophy, and math, based largely on the achievements of the ancient Greeks, made brilliant contributions to this sum of knowledge at a time when Latin, Christendom had lost much of Greco-Roman thought and culture. It's actually true. In the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance especially, the when it looked like much of the inheritance, the writings of the Greek philosophers had been lost forever. There were only copies of fragments here and there. When Europeans started to fight the Muslims and finally started to push them out of Europe, they were shocked to see in churches and mosques that there were these documents in the copies usually of Aristotle and other Greek thinkers and poets' works, which must have been shocking to people because they weren't sure these things even existed. They'd seen them talked about in Aristotle's own writings or one of his contemporaries, but I don't know if that book actually exists. I've never seen it before. And now a lot of these things start turning up. But it's a testimony to how much the Islamic world, at the height of Islamic civilization in its early centuries, was enamored with and saw a value in Greek thought and learning. Bentley and Ziegler, our guys, say Muslims also found much to appreciate in the scientific and medical thought they encountered in India. With the aid of their powerful and flexible mathematics, Indian scholars were able to carry out precise astronomical calculations, which helped inspire Muslim astronomy. Indian medicine appealed to Muslims because of its treatment for specific ailments and its use of antidotes for poison. They uniformly praised Indian mathematical, scientific, and medical thought, which they avidly adopted. So this is a golden age in terms of science and technology, as well as in cultural advance also. One of the famous and brilliant philosophers of this period in Muslim history is Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, the Ghazal. A philosopher against philosophy? Some think so, but I think there's a number of ways to look at this. Quoting a really good book, not about al-Ghazali himself, but at least partly devoted to some of his ideas. The author says the most perceptive of the Arab philosophers was the Ghazal, Abu Hamid Muhammad al-Ghazali. To slow down. Writing with remarkable prescience about the scientists he called naturalists, in the 11th century, al-Ghazali was quite prepared to admit that their studies served to reveal the wonders of creation. No one can make a careful study of anatomy and the wonderful uses of the organs of the human body without attaining to the necessary knowledge that there is a perfection in the order which the framer, meaning the creator of the world, God, gave to the animal frame, and especially to that of man. By the same token, to place in doubt the survival of the soul is to deny the future life, he says, heaven, hell, resurrection, and judgment. And this is to corrupt the system of justice by which life must be regulated, because there does not remain any reward for obedience or any punishments for sin if you take soul and true belief away. With this curb removed, al-Ghazali predicts men and women will give way to a bestial indulgence of their appetites. So he's saying a number of things here. One is that religion is necessary. Without it, you're going to have complete chaos, anarchy, immorality, widespread. But it's not quite, I think, a rejection of Greek philosophy or philosophy and reason. It's, I think, something more subtle than that. It's saying that reason has its place. The quote here says it. That's what he apparently believed, but that it can't substitute for religion because it can't do anything there. And again, al-Ghazali is not the first or only person in world history that's come to that conclusion. It's still believed by some today that science sort of can't tell us anything about God, but without science, your society's not going to get too far in terms of more practical day-to-day concerns like jobs and production of goods and buying of goods and survival, economically speaking. So al-Ghazali is merely saying not that philosophy itself and rational thought are useless. He's saying that they're limited. They can only go so far. They can't answer a question sort of why. Why does the universe exist? They can, sort of, examine and understand how the universe exists. So I actually find Al-Ghazali to be a quite in-depth thinker, and one with a great deal of wisdom, because he's pondering the big questions, the metaphysical questions about meaning in life. He's not quite as closed-minded and non-rational as I think sometimes he's made out to be. However, someone also from this era of great fame and apparent brilliance was a philosopher the Europeans became aware of, and they called him Averroes, and he defended rational thought without the same kind of criticism and ambivalence or kind of a more complicated position than we just saw Al-Ghazali had. Professor Bentley says he followed Aristotle, Averroes, in seeking to articulate a purely rational understanding of the world. Ibn Rushd's work not only, as Averroes, helped shape Islamic philosophy, but also found its way to the schools and universities of Western Europe. His reliance on natural reason went too far, however, for many Muslims, who placed more value on the revelations of the Quran than on the fruits of human logic. After the 13th century, Muslim philosophers and theologians who dominated the madrasas, schools, drew inspiration more from Islamic sources than from Greek philosophy. So, over time, there's no doubt that Al-Ghazali's thinking was preferable to Averroes, but both of them embraced reason in their own way, and both were great contributors to rational thought, just in an environment that was increasingly and would go on to be sort of more and more dominated by the religion of Islam. The Muslims made major strides in agriculture in the early Islamic world. It talks here, I won't read the quotes, you can read them, but about, first of all, how widespread their crops were. Keep in mind the map we saw of the huge piece of real estate that the Muslim world controlled, and they sent all kinds of crops and products to places far and wide in their own empire. They also saw sort of this huge trade getting further and further away from the world. A lot of the crops that were introduced, which you see in the above quote, oranges, lemon, limes, artichoke, spinach, etc., not only went to the far edges of the empire, but they actually grew, sometimes in hot, formidable climates where most things didn't grow. So this, of course, was extremely beneficial for the peoples outside of the Arabian Peninsula that the Muslims had conquered. There was an explosive urban growth during the early years of the Islamic Empire. Delhi, Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, Cairo, Alexandria, and on became huge cities. Some of these cities had several 100,000 people living in them. They all had gigantic markets and thriving commerce, trade, artisans selling their wares. These cities also became important centers of industrial production, making textiles and leather, even iron, metallurgy. So one of, I think, the best measures of the complexity of a culture is urban centers. How big are the urban centers? How many of them are there? And there were a lot in this. Now, again, some of them they conquered, but like the Romans, they conquered them and then fixed them up. So there's a lot of fixers-uppers in here, as well as their own cities. Commerce in the Muslim world, or trade, you can see from the map that the trade networks were from east to west and back again. This is astonishingly complicated. An example of something that I called spontaneous order Nobody planned these out. Nobody created this network of trade. but it did work out this way, and it functioned particularly effectively. The 11th century saw both the Abbasid caliphates and the Byzantine Empire to the north, the survivor of the Roman Empire, the eastern half of the Roman Empire, and they were both threatened by Muslim nomads from Central Asia, the Seljuk Turks. As Professor Diker says, adopting a narrow interpretation of the Quran and the Sharia law, law code behind Islam, they encouraged a rigid approach to sacred doctrine that would make it more difficult for the faithful to respond effectively to social changes taking place within Islamic society. Basically saying, as the world, even their empire, modernized, the Seljuk Turks were kind of pushing back in the opposite directions, and it made for all kinds of tension and friction, and may have cost Muslim societies in some ways. Well, if the Seljuk Turks' influence is, sort of changing the culture, the Mongol capture of Baghdad and overall invasion of, the Muslim world in 1258 or around, thereabouts, because that's just the date that Baghdad fell. But these are certainly a low point, if not the low point, in Islamic history in the Middle Ages. Karen Armstrong says the Mongolian conquests, the Mongols, were always accompanied by total devastation and extermination, unless the cities surrendered immediately and unconditionally. It's actually said, and with some truth, I'm sure, that the peoples of the Middle East, even to this day, have not forgotten and forgiven the Mongol conquests, which radically changed their societies and were quite